A Navy SEAL thought the worst night of his life was already behind him, until his K9 refused to leave an old wooden bridge in the middle of a snowstorm. Under that bridge, they found a terrified boy, a wounded puppy, and a sketchbook full of secrets. But the deeper they followed the dog's instinct, the darker the truth became. Missing military, K9s, erased records, and a crime hidden behind a rescue center were all waiting to be exposed. And for one broken soldier, the dog's loyalty would lead him back to the truth he had been running from for years. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. Leave your thoughts after the story, and please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers so we can keep creating more powerful stories. Red Ash Valley looked peaceful, only to people passing through. From the highway, it was a postcard town tucked between black pine ridges and white winter fields, with one main road, one church steeple, one diner that smelled of burnt coffee and maple syrup, and a row of old wooden bridges that crossed the narrow streams, feeding down from the mountains. But people who lived there knew winter had a way of exposing what summer hid. It showed which roofs were weak, which families were running out of firewood, which roads were never properly repaired, and which people had learned to survive by keeping their doors locked and their stories buried. Nate Rourke lived beyond the last mailbox on the North Road, in a weathered cabin pressed against the tree line. He was a male, U.S. Navy SEAL in his early 30s with an angular, rugged face, a sharp jawline, cold blue-gray eyes, and a modern short undercut that made him look disciplined even when he had not slept. He was clean-shaven, built with the hard athletic frame of a man trained to move under weight and pain, and he wore a complete green digital camouflage uniform with matching blouse and trousers, properly fitted and fully buttoned, a plain black belt, and black combat boots. No helmet, no hat, no sunglasses, no vest, no extra gear, no weapon, no unnecessary thing to hide behind. People in town saw that uniform and thought he still belonged to a world of orders and missions. They did not see the way he sat in the diner with his back to the wall, counted exits without meaning to, and stopped talking whenever a helicopter passed too low. They did not know he had once led men through dust and radio static, or that one wrong coordinate had turned a rescue route into a trap, or that he had come home with a dog and a silence so heavy it seemed to enter rooms before he did. To most of Red Ash Valley, Nate was the cold soldier at the edge of town. To the elderly widow who woke one morning to find split firewood stacked beside her porch, he was an unnamed kindness. To the old mechanic whose furnace had been fixed while he slept, he was a mystery with boot prints in the snow. To the boy at the pharmacy whose mother could not afford antibiotics, he was the stranger who paid the balance and left before anyone could thank him. Nate did not want gratitude. Gratitude required conversation, and conversation led to questions, and questions led to the one place he never wanted to go. The only living soul allowed fully into Nate's silence was Atlas. Atlas was a full-grown male Belgian Malinois K9, 4 to 5 years old, lean and muscular, with a deep fawn to mahogany coat, a distinct black facial mask, upright ears, and intense dark amber eyes that seemed to judge the world without cruelty. He wore a tan tactical K9 vest and a simple working dog collar, and even inside the cabin he carried himself with focused, obedient, mission-ready calm. Atlas had been with Nate before the cabin, before Red Ash Valley, before the nightmares had names Nate could say out loud. In the old life, Atlas had run beside him through smoke, dust, metal doors, and impossible noise. In the new life, Atlas stood guard over quieter enemies, panic, memory, guilt, and the long hours before dawn when Nate's hands shook for reasons he refused to explain. When Nate woke from the same dream, breathing hard, unable to separate the cabin walls from a place half a world away, Atlas never barked. He only came close, placed his head on Nate's knee, and stayed there until Nate remembered where he was. That night, the storm began before sunset. Snow fell in thick, slanted sheets, and the pines bent like old men under the weight of it. The generator behind the cabin coughed twice, flickered the lights, then steadied. Nate stood by the window with a mug of coffee gone cold in his hand, watching the tree line disappear and reappear in the white. Atlas lay near the door, but his ears kept shifting, not toward the generator, not toward the chimney, toward the North Road. Nate noticed, because noticing was the one habit war had not stolen from him. It had sharpened it into something close to instinct. "You hear something?" he asked. Atlas lifted his head but did not bark. That was the first sign. Atlas barked when a threat needed to know it had been seen. Silence meant something else. Nate set down the mug, checked the door latch, then opened the cabin door. Cold rushed in, clean and brutal. Atlas rose in one smooth motion and stepped outside before Nate gave the command. They were supposed to make one short sweep around the property. Nate told himself that as he pulled the door shut behind them. Check the generator, check the shed, check the tree line. Back inside, nothing heroic, nothing foolish. The wind cut across the open yard and dragged loose snow over the ground until the world seemed to move in layers. Atlas did not go toward the shed. He turned toward the north road, body low, nose working, ears fixed forward. "Atlas," Nate said, firm but quiet. The dog stopped for half a second, looked back, then continued. That look bothered Nate more than disobedience would have. Atlas was not ignoring him. Atlas was asking him to follow. Nate moved after him through the storm. The road beyond the cabin curved down toward an old wooden bridge that crossed a frozen creek near the back property line of Red Ash K9 Recovery Center, a private K9 rehabilitation facility that took in retired working dogs, abandoned shepherds, and any animal with enough history to make adoption complicated. Nate had never trusted the place completely, though he had never had a clean reason why. In daylight, its main building looked respectable. White siding, blue sign, donation banner, warm lights in the front windows. But at night, the rear shed sat too far from the public road, too quiet behind the pines. Atlas had never liked that stretch. Tonight, he hated it. He reached the bridge and stopped so suddenly, Nate nearly stepped into him. The Belgian Malinois stood rigid, paws planted on the snow-covered planks, head angled downward toward the black space beneath the bridge. A low sound rolled out of his chest. Not a hunting growl, not warning at a stranger. Something deeper, almost pained. Nate felt the skin tighten between his shoulders. "What is it?" he whispered. Atlas did not move. The creek below was half frozen, thin water whispering under plates of ice. The wind shoved snow through the gaps in the bridge rails. Nate crouched, one gloved hand on Atlas's vest, and looked into the darkness beneath the boards. At first he saw only shadow, then something shifted, small, human. A pale face turned toward him from under the bridge. For one impossible second, Nate did not move, because the face below him was not part of the storm. It was part of a memory. A child's eyes, wide and stunned. A body trying to become smaller than fear. Nate heard, not with his ears, but somewhere behind his ribs, the broken radio call from years ago. The voice of a young teammate saying they had found civilians in the wrong building. The coordinates were wrong. Everything was wrong. Atlas pressed forward, not lunging, not threatening, but lowering his body until his chest nearly touched the snow. The dog made a soft sound Nate had heard only twice before in his life, once beside a wounded handler overseas, once beside Nate himself the first night after they came home. It was not alarm. It was recognition of pain. And that sound cut through Nate's hesitation like a hand reaching into deep water. Whatever was under that bridge was not a threat. It was someone the world had failed to reach in time. Nate dropped to one knee and angled his body sideways, making himself smaller. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice low, controlled, the voice he used when sudden movement could make things worse. "My name is Nate. This is Atlas. We're going to get you out of there." The child did not answer. He was an American boy, about 11 years old, small and thin from stress, with pale skin, anxious blue-gray eyes, and soft brown hair flattened under a dark navy knitted beanie. He wore a thick dark blue winter coat, a gray wool sweater visible at the collar, faded dark jeans, and brown winter boots caked with ice. A small worn canvas backpack was jammed beside him. In his arms, wrapped in a worn gray blanket, was a small mixed-breed puppy, 3 or 4 months old, fragile and trembling, with tan and cream fur, floppy ears, and round, dark, frightened eyes. The boy held the puppy so tightly that Nate understood before he asked. Whatever had happened, the child had run with the dog, not from it. Atlas eased down the embankment first. The boy flinched when the dog came close, then froze as Atlas stopped just out of reach and lowered his head. The puppy made a faint noise. Atlas sniffed the air, then touched his nose gently to the boy's sleeve. The boy's eyes filled, but he still did not cry. "He knows," the boy whispered. "He knows where my dad went." Nate felt those words settle into the storm. "What's your name?" he asked. The boy swallowed, lips blue from cold. "Eli. Eli Turner. Turner." Nate knew the name in the way small towns made sure everybody knew names even when nobody knew stories. Graham Turner had died 6 months earlier in a truck accident on the mountain road. Former K9 logistics man, people said. Widower, quiet, left behind a son. Nate had seen the funeral from across the street and kept walking because funerals were doors he no longer opened. "Eli," Nate said carefully, "can you move?" The boy tried, failed, and made a small sound of pain. Nate saw the shaking then, not just from fear but from cold. Hypothermia was not a dramatic thing at first. It was quiet. It made people slow. It made them stop making good decisions. Nate looked up at the bridge, then toward the road where the storm had already started erasing their tracks. "I'm getting you warm," he said. "Then we call the sheriff." Eli shook his head sharply. "No, no police. You're freezing." He said not to trust anyone with papers. Nate did not ask who he meant. Not yet. The wrong question too soon could shut the boy down completely. Nate tried his phone. No service. He climbed halfway up the bank, held it higher, caught one weak bar, and sent a short emergency message to the sheriff's office. Found boy near North Bridge. Possible hypothermia. Bringing to cabin. Nate. R. The sending wheel spun, failed, spun again, then flashed uncertainly before the signal died. He could not know whether it had gone through. The choice in front of him was simple. In the brutal way, emergencies were simple. Leave the boy in the storm and obey procedure, or take him to warmth and explain later. Nate had lived long enough with the cost of hesitation. He did not hesitate now. He wrapped his outer jacket around Eli, lifted him carefully, and guided him up the embankment while Atlas stayed close to the puppy, as if the tiny animal were part of the mission. Eli was lighter than Nate expected. Too light. The boy clutched the puppy and the backpack, refusing to let either go. The walk back to the cabin felt longer than the road had ever felt. Snow erased distance. Wind shoved at their shoulders. Atlas moved ahead, then circled back, then moved ahead again, checking the path like he was escorting a team through danger. At the cabin, Nate brought Eli inside, set him near the stove, wrapped him in blankets, and warmed water slowly because shock and cold demanded patience. He checked the puppy, found no obvious broken limb but saw a small shaved patch near the neck and a tiny red mark that looked too clean to be from the woods. That detail stayed with him. Eli watched every movement, suspicious and exhausted. Only when Atlas lay beside the stove, close enough for warmth but not crowding him, did Eli's breathing begin to slow. "My dad said dogs remember what people erase," Eli murmured. Nate looked at him. "Your dad was Graham Turner." Eli nodded once. "They said he crashed." "Who said?" Eli's eyes moved to the window. Beyond the glass, the storm swallowed the road. "Everyone." Nate let the silence sit. He had learned long ago that frightened people sometimes told the truth only when they were not being chased by questions. When Eli finally loosened his grip on the backpack, a sketchbook slid half out of the side pocket. The cover was bent and damp, the corners softened from use. Nate picked it up only after Eli gave a faint nod. Inside were drawings in pencil and dark crayon. Some were clearly a child's work. A dog, with 2 large ears. A bridge. A cabin. A man with square shoulders. But others were not random. A white box truck with a partial license plate. A blue-black logo reading SRS in a circle. A long building behind a fence. A metal door with a keypad. A man's hand wearing a black ring. Rows of numbers written beside rough drawings of crates. Nate turned one page and saw the sign Eli had drawn above a gate. Red Ash K9 Recovery Center. Under it, in small, uneven letters, the boy had written, "Dad said don't forget." Nate's chest tightened. Outside, the wind hit the cabin hard enough to rattle the window. Atlas rose instantly, not toward the door, but toward the table. He sniffed the sketchbook once, then his body changed. His ears came forward, his shoulders locked, and the low sound returned in his chest. Nate followed the dog's gaze. Atlas was not looking at Eli. He was not looking at the puppy. He was staring through the window, through the storm, in the direction of the old bridge and the K9 recovery center beyond it. Eli pulled the blanket higher around himself and whispered, "That's where my dad went before he died." Nate closed the sketchbook slowly. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the storm less like weather and more like a curtain someone had pulled across the truth. He had brought a freezing child inside because it was the right thing to do. But as Atlas stood rigid beside the table, eyes fixed on the white darkness beyond the glass, Nate understood that the night had brought something else to his door too. Not just a boy, not just a wounded puppy, a trail, and Atlas had already chosen to follow it. By morning, the storm had weakened into a pale gray snowfall that drifted sideways across the windows of Nate Rourke's cabin. The fire in the iron stove had burned low, but the room was warm enough now that the frost had melted from Eli Turner's eyelashes, and the blue had faded from his lips. The boy sat on the old couch with 2 blankets around his shoulders, the small Tangent and Cream puppy, asleep against his chest, while Atlas lay on the floor between him and the door like a silent promise. Nate had not slept. He had spent the night doing what men like him did when there was nothing to fight, and too much to think about, checking the windows, watching the road, warming water, listening to the wind, and trying not to look too long at the sketchbook on the table. The drawings had stayed there like a thing alive. Sloan Recovery Systems, Red Ash K9 Recovery Center, a locked metal door, a black ring, a row of numbers drawn by a child who should have been drawing mountains and dogs, not evidence. Nate stood at the sink, still wearing the same green digital camouflage uniform, sleeves buttoned, boots dry now but marked with salt and snow. He looked calm from the outside, but inside him the old machinery had started moving again. Patterns, routes, motives, threats. A freezing child under a bridge was not an accident. A wounded puppy with a clean mark near its neck was not a forest injury. A dead father telling his son to remember the dogs was not grief talking in circles. Outside, tires crushed snow on the road. Atlas lifted his head before Nate heard the engine. His ears came forward, but he did not growl. That mattered. Nate moved to the window and saw a sheriff's SUV coming up the drive, followed by a second vehicle with county markings. "Eli," Nate said quietly, "the sheriff is here." The boy stiffened so fast the puppy woke and trembled. "No," Eli whispered. "You said not yet." "I said I'd call them," Nate replied. "And I tried. They need to know you're alive." Eli's eyes went to Atlas, as if the dog might overrule the adults. Atlas only watched the door, steady and unreadable. Sheriff Cole Maddox entered first when Nate opened the door. He was an American small-town sheriff in his late 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a square weathered face, short dark brown hair streaked with gray, tired brown eyes, and salt and pepper stubble that made him look like sleep was something he respected but rarely received. He wore a dark brown winter sheriff jacket with a small badge, a tan uniform shirt, dark brown trousers, black duty belt, black snow boots, and a simple black knit beanie pulled low against the cold. Maddox was not a cruel man, but he had the habit of men who had seen enough lies to distrust the first clean version of any story. His eyes took in the room quickly. Nate's uniform, Eli on the couch, the puppy, the blankets, the sketchbook, Atlas positioned between everyone and the door. Behind him came Deputy Hannah Vale, a 32-year-old American woman with a medium-tall athletic build, a focused oval face, sharp gray-blue eyes, and dark blonde hair tied in a neat, low ponytail beneath the collar of her dark navy winter deputy jacket. She wore a gray thermal shirt, dark tactical trousers, a black duty belt, and black winter boots. Her face was calm, but not soft. She looked like someone who had learned to trust details more than volume. Maddox did not draw his weapon, but his hand rested near his belt. "Nate," he said, voice even. "We got half a message from you at 2. 13 inches the morning, found boy. Possible hypothermia. Bringing to cabin." Then nothing. Nate stepped back from the doorway. Signal died. Maddox's gaze moved to Eli. "You should have kept trying. He was turning blue under a bridge, and now a missing child is in your cabin." Nate's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed controlled. "A living child." That stopped the sheriff for half a breath. Hannah moved past him, slower than Maddox, less interested in making a point than reading the room. She crouched several feet from Eli, not too close, keeping her hands visible. "Eli Turner?" she asked. Her voice had a practical gentleness. "I'm Deputy Vale. I'm going to check if you're hurt." "I won't touch you unless you say it's okay." Eli did not answer, but he did not pull away when she checked his fingers, his pupils, the color around his mouth. Hannah looked at the damp clothes folded near the stove, then at Nate. He was outside a long time. "Long enough," Nate said. "He had early hypothermia signs." Hannah nodded once. "He probably did." Maddox heard that and his expression shifted, not into trust, but away from accusation. Small difference. Important one. Eli clutched the puppy tighter when Maddox stepped closer. The sheriff noticed and stopped. "Your aunt called when you didn't come home," Maddox said. "Half the county has been looking for you." Eli looked down. "I didn't run away." "Then what happened?" The boy's mouth opened, closed, then trembled with the weight of all the adult words he did not have. Atlas rose and crossed the room. Maddox tensed, but Nate lifted 2 fingers slightly, a silent hold. Atlas did not approach the sheriff. He went to Eli and lowered himself beside the couch, placing his black masked head near the boy's boot. Eli touched the dog's ear with shaking fingers. Only then did he speak. "Someone was at the center after dark. I saw the white truck again, the one Dad drew before he died." "Your father didn't draw trucks," Maddox said carefully. "Your father died in an accident." Eli's face hardened in a way no child's face should. "That's what they wrote." The room went quiet. Nate watched Maddox absorb the sentence. It had landed somewhere uncomfortable. Graham Turner had been known in Red Ash Valley as a quiet man, a former K9 logistics worker with a careful way of speaking and a habit of taking his son everywhere after his wife died. 6 months ago, his truck had gone off a mountain road in icy weather. People had called it tragic, then understandable, then finished. Small towns did that. They wrapped things in explanations so they could keep functioning. Hannah glanced toward the sketchbook. "May I?" Eli hesitated. Nate did not move. Atlas blinked slowly, as if waiting. Eli finally nodded. Hannah opened the book and turned pages without rushing. Her expression changed when she saw the repeated symbols. The same truck from different angles, the same logo, the same metal door, the same hand with a black ring. "These are very specific," she said. "Eli, did your dad ask you to draw these?" "He said if I saw something twice, draw it once. If I saw it 3 times, draw it better." Nate felt that sentence go through him. Graham had not used his son like a file. He had taught him how to survive with the only tool a frightened child could carry without being searched. Hannah turned 1 page and stopped. The drawing showed a dog's face split down the middle. One side looked like Atlas, black mask, and upright ears. The other side was an older dog with a grayer muzzle and tired eyes. Beneath it, Eli had written in uneven letters, "Same name, not same dog." Atlas stood so suddenly that the puppy startled awake. The Belgian Malinois stepped to the table, sniffed the page once, then backed away with a low, wounded sound that made Nate's chest tighten. It was not aggression. It was recognition without understanding. Maddox looked from the drawing to Atlas, then to Nate. For the first time since entering the cabin, the sheriff seemed less concerned with what Nate had done and more concerned with what everyone else had missed. Eli whispered, "Dad said they use names like coats. Put one on, take one off, make a dog disappear." The puppy whimpered, and that brought Dr. Claire Hensley into the chapter of the morning, as if the storm had delayed her only long enough for the truth to become unavoidable. She arrived in a mud-splashed veterinary truck 20 minutes after Nate called from the landline, carrying a compact medical kit in one hand and a thermal blanket in the other. Claire was an American female veterinarian, 38 years old, with a slim but strong build, a calm, intelligent face, warm hazel eyes, and shoulder-length chestnut brown hair tied back in a practical low ponytail. She wore a forest green veterinary field jacket over a cream turtleneck sweater, dark work pants, brown waterproof boots, and a simple medical ID badge clipped near her collar. Claire had once worked with military K9 rehabilitation cases, and it showed in the way she entered the room. No sudden movements, no baby talk, No assumption that an animal in pain was harmless or dangerous until it told her. Atlas watched her, then allowed her space. "That's new," Maddox muttered. "Atlas doesn't approve people fast." Nate said nothing, but he had noticed. Claire knelt near Eli after asking permission and examined the puppy with careful hands. "Small male, 3 or 4 months," she said. "Underweight, mild dehydration, pads scraped, no obvious fracture." Then her fingers paused near the puppy's neck. She parted the fur and found the small red mark Nate had seen. Her face did not change much, but her eyes sharpened. "This isn't from running through brush." Eli swallowed. "What is it?" Claire's thumb hovered near the mark without pressing. "A needle site. Clean. Recent." Maddox looked at her. "You're sure?" "Sure enough to be unhappy." She checked the other side of the puppy's neck, then the shoulder. There may have been a small shaved patch here before the fur shifted. Someone handled this dog in a controlled setting. "Like a vet?" Hannah asked. Claire's mouth tightened. "Like someone using veterinary tools. That isn't always the same thing." Nate looked toward the sketchbook again. The metal door, the truck, the dogs. Graham Turner had seen something, and now his son had carried it into Nate's cabin under a bridge of snow. Maddox stepped aside to make a call, but the storm still made communication unreliable. He got through long enough to confirm the Child Welfare Office had an emergency placement ready at the county shelter annex. When he hung up, Nate already knew what he was going to say. "We need to take Eli in," Maddox said. Eli's panic returned instantly. "No, it's not jail," Hannah said. "It's a protected place until we figure out who you can stay with. They'll know." "Who?" Maddox asked. Eli shook his head. Claire wrapped the puppy more securely. "Sheriff, if someone did inject this dog, and if Eli ran from that same place, he needs controlled protection, not just a couch in a cabin." Nate hated that she was right. He hated the way law could be both shield and cage. "I'm not trying to keep him," he said. "But don't treat this like a runaway." Maddox met his eyes. "I'm not." It was the closest thing to trust Nate had heard from him. They gathered Eli's things. The boy refused to let go of the sketchbook, and Hannah did not make him. That earned her a glance from Nate, small but approving. Outside, the snow had thinned, but the world remained white and muffled. Maddox's SUV sat near the cabin steps, engine running, exhaust rising in gray clouds. Eli stepped onto the porch with the puppy in Claire's blanket. Atlas followed. At first, Nate thought the dog wanted to stay near the boy. Then Atlas stopped at the SUV. His whole body changed. Ears forward, tail still, head lowered. He sniffed once along the passenger door, then moved to the rear wheel well and froze. A growl built low in his chest. Maddox frowned. "What now?" Nate crouched beside Atlas, following the dog's nose to the underside of the vehicle. Hannah was already moving, flashlight out. She lay one knee in the snow, looked beneath the chassis, and went very still. "Sheriff." Her voice had changed. Maddox came around. Hannah reached under the frame and carefully pulled free a small black device, no larger than a matchbox, held in place by a magnetic plate. Its tiny light blinked once, almost shyly, in the morning cold. For a moment, nobody spoke. The puppy shivered in Eli's arms. Claire looked at the device, then at the road. Nate looked at Atlas. Atlas was staring toward the tree line beyond the driveway, where the tire tracks from the sheriff's SUV had already begun to fill with snow. Maddox's face hardened, not with pride wounded, but with the anger of a man realizing someone had walked close enough to his vehicle to turn the law into a leash. "Hannah," he said quietly, "bag it." She removed an evidence pouch from her kit and sealed the tracker. Her hands were steady, but her eyes were not. Eli's voice came thin from the porch. "They found me again." Nate turned to him. "Not yet," he said. "Atlas found them first." Maddox did not cancel the transfer to the shelter annex, but everything about the decision changed. He called ahead through dispatch, ordered the annex to restrict access, told them no visitors, no maintenance personnel, no outside calls without verification. Hannah would follow with Eli, not leave him to strangers and paperwork. Claire agreed to take the puppy to her clinic after documenting the injury, but Eli began to shake at the thought of being separated. After a tense moment, Maddox allowed the puppy to ride with him until Claire could examine him properly at the annex. It was not perfect procedure, but it was humane, and sometimes those two things had to be negotiated in real time. Before Eli got into the SUV, he turned back to Nate. "You believe me?" Nate looked at the sketchbook clutched against the boy's chest, then at Atlas, who stood beside him like a dark flame against the snow. "I believe you saw something." Eli waited, needing more than that. Nate gave him the truth he could offer. "And I believe your father was trying to protect you." The boy's eyes filled, but he did not cry. He climbed into the SUV with the puppy wrapped in his arms. Hannah sat beside him, instead of in the front. A small choice that told Nate she understood fear better than she advertised. Maddox closed the door and looked back at Nate. "Don't go near the recovery center without me." Nate almost smiled. Almost. "Then don't take too long." Maddox held his gaze for a second, then got behind the wheel. The vehicles rolled down the drive, slower this time, watched by a dog who trusted almost no one and a soldier who trusted even less. Atlas stood in the snow until the taillights disappeared between the pines. Then he turned, not toward the cabin, but toward the distant roofline of Red Ash K9 Recovery Center, barely visible through the trees. Nate followed his gaze. The storm had weakened, but the cold remained. Somewhere beyond the pines, dogs had been renamed, moved, erased, maybe buried only on paper. Somewhere, Graham Turner's death had become a line in a report that his son refused to believe. And now someone had dared to put a tracker under a sheriff's vehicle. Nate rested one hand lightly on Atlas's vest. "Yeah," he said under his breath. "I know." Atlas did not look away from the recovery center. Neither did Nate. By late afternoon, the snow had thinned into a slow, powdery fall that made Red Ash Valley look cleaner than it really was. Sheriff Cole Maddox had not slept. Deputy Hannah Vale had not left Eli Turner's side for more than 10 minutes, and Nate Rourke had spent the hours after the tracker was found doing the one thing he hated most, waiting inside rules made by other people. Maddox had called twice from the county shelter annex to confirm Eli was safe, under restricted access, with no outside visitors allowed. Dr. Claire Hensley had taken the puppy into a small exam room at the annex, cleaned the scratches, documented the needle mark, and promised Eli the little dog would not be taken away from him unless medically necessary. None of that made Nate feel better. He stood beside his cabin window, still in the same green digital camouflage uniform, still with that composed face people mistook for calm, while Atlas remained at the door, alert and silent. The Belgian Malinois had not relaxed since the sheriff's SUV disappeared down the road. Every so often, Atlas lifted his black masked face toward the north, toward the trees, toward the place beyond the old bridge where the sign for Red Ash K9 Recovery Center stood. Nate knew that look. It was not impatience, it was certainty. When Maddox finally called and said he had legal grounds for a welfare and records check at the center, Nate did not say he was ready. He simply took his coat from the chair, checked Atlas's collar, and opened the door. The cold outside was sharp enough to make the lungs tighten, but Nate welcomed it. Cold was honest. Cold did not pretend to be charity while hiding a locked room behind a clean front office. Red Ash K9 Recovery Center sat beyond the North Bridge on a cleared patch of land bordered by pines and chain-link fencing. In daylight, a white main building with blue trim stood near the front gate. A painted sign showed a smiling German shepherd beside the words, "Restoring Service, Trust, and Home." There were donation bins near the door, a rack of pamphlets about retired working dogs, and a fenced exercise yard where two older shepherd mixes watched the arriving vehicles with tired curiosity. A few volunteers moved around with buckets and leashes, ordinary people doing ordinary work under a winter sky. That was what bothered Nate. Places hiding ugly things often worked hard to keep something beautiful visible at the front. Maddox parked near the entrance, Hannah behind him, Claire beside Nate in her veterinary truck. Atlas stepped out first and scanned the property with controlled intensity. He did not bark. He did not pull. He only breathed in, turned his head slowly, and fixed on the rear of the property where a long storage building sat partly hidden behind the main structure. Maddox noticed. "We start at the office," he said. Nate's eyes stayed on Atlas. "He won't." Maddox gave him a hard look. "This is still my scene." "Then watch your scene," Nate said. "He's already found the part you need." The front door opened before Maddox could answer. Mara Whitcomb stepped out with a ring of keys in one hand and suspicion written across her face. She was an American woman in her early 50s, slim and hardened by years of outdoor work, with sharp, tired features, pale green eyes, and short auburn hair threaded with gray and tucked behind her ears. She wore a dark olive quilted work vest over a beige wool sweater, dark utility pants, brown rubber work boots, and a keyring clipped to her belt. Mara looked like the kind of woman who had learned to keep failing things alive through stubbornness alone. Old buildings, old dogs, old promises, maybe old lies. "Sheriff Maddox," she said, voice tight. "If this is about the Turner boy, I already told Deputy Vale over the phone that I haven't seen him." "This is about several things now," Maddox replied. "A missing child, a wounded puppy, a tracker under my vehicle, and records connected to Graham Turner." At Graham's name, something flickered in Mara's face, so quick most people would have missed it. Nate did not. Atlas did not either. The dog's ears shifted forward. Mara looked at Nate then, and her eyes went immediately to his uniform and the K9 at his side. "I don't allow outside dogs in the rear areas." "He's not outside," Nate said. "He's trained." "That doesn't make him welcome." Claire stepped forward, calm but firm. "Mara, if your center is clean, let us verify it. If there's nothing here, this ends faster." Mara's jaw flexed. "You too, Claire?" "Especially me," Claire said. "Because if someone used veterinary tools on a puppy connected to this place, I want to know who." The words landed harder than Maddox's badge. Mara stepped aside, not because she wanted to, but because she had done the math and understood refusal would make her look worse. Inside, the main building smelled of disinfectant, old blankets, wet fur, and coffee. The reception area had framed photographs of adopted dogs, thank you letters from veterans, and a bulletin board covered with handwritten notes from families who had found companions there. For a moment, even Nate had to admit the place was not only a mask. Some good had happened here. That made the wrongness worse, not better. Evil was easier to face when it did not borrow the furniture of kindness. Mara led them through the exam room, the kennel hallway, and the small office where paper files sat in neat cabinets. Claire checked records, while Hannah photographed transfer logs, and Maddox asked questions in the steady, patient tone of a man who knew pressure worked better when applied gradually. Atlas remained near Nate, but his attention kept drifting toward the rear door. When they passed a row of kennels, a gray-muzzled Labrador lifted his head and thumped his tail twice. Atlas glanced at him, then looked away, focused on something deeper in the building. Nate felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Atlas had walked past wounded men the same way when a bigger threat waited beyond them. Compassion did not distract him from mission. It sharpened him. Mara insisted the rear storage area held only feed, old crates, and winter supplies. But when she unlocked the rear door, Atlas moved before anyone else. He stepped into the cold corridor connecting the main building to the rear storage structure, nose low, body controlled, each paw placed with careful silence. The storage building was long, windowless on one side, with a concrete floor and fluorescent lights that hummed overhead. At first glance, Mara's explanation seemed plausible. Stacks of feed bags, shelves of cleaning supplies, broken crates, folded tarps, but the smell was wrong. Even Nate could detect the heavy bite of disinfectant layered over something older and more animal. Claire noticed too. Her face went still. "This floor was cleaned recently," she said. "We clean every day," Mara snapped. "Not like this." Atlas went to the far left corner where several metal kennels stood empty, their doors hanging open. He stopped at the third kennel and lowered his head to the drain channel beneath it. A low sound came from his chest. Nate crouched. In the drain gap, caught against the metal edge, was a small clump of fawn-colored fur. Claire pulled on gloves and collected it. Hannah photographed the kennel. Maddox looked at Mara. "Who was housed here?" Mara folded her arms. "No one recently." "Define recently." "I don't track empty cages by the hour, Sheriff." Nate ran his eyes over the kennel door. 3 deep scratches cut through the paint from the inside. Not old, not rusted. Something wanted out, he said. Atlas suddenly backed away from the kennel and turned toward the blank wall behind the feed stacks. His body lowered, not in fear, but in recognition so intense it seemed to pull the air from the room. He walked to the wall, pressed his nose against a seam in the wood paneling, and let out a sound Nate had heard only in the aftermath of loss. Not a bark, not a growl, a low, broken exhale. Claire moved one of the feed bags aside. Behind it, scratched faintly into the lower panel, were 3 uneven letters. Eli. The room went silent. Mara's face drained of color. Hannah whispered, "He was here." Nate looked at the letters, then at Atlas, and something colder than anger settled in him. Eli had not merely imagined this place. He had been close enough to leave his name behind, or someone had left it for him to find. Either way, the recovery center had just stopped being a location in a child's drawing. It had become a crime scene wearing a charity sign. Maddox ordered everyone to step back while Hannah documented the wall. Mara kept saying she did not know, but her voice had lost its hard edge. It sounded thinner now, frightened. Before Maddox could press her further, a side door opened, and Dr. Mason Greer entered the storage building. He was an American male veterinarian in his mid-50s, thin and tired, with a pale-lined face, deep-set gray eyes, short graying hair, and a worn expression that made him look older than his years. He wore a dark charcoal veterinary coat over a light blue button-up shirt, dark brown trousers, black practical shoes, and a small clinic ID badge clipped at the pocket. In one hand, he held a clipboard. In the other, a pen he kept tapping against the metal clip. His eyes moved from Maddox to Claire, then to Nate and Atlas. Something like irritation crossed his face, but beneath it was something less controlled. Fear, maybe. Guilt, maybe. "What is this?" Greer asked. "A search without a warrant?" Maddox turned. "A welfare check connected to a missing child, animal injury, and evidence of tracking my department vehicle. You want to test me on paperwork today, Mason?" Greer's mouth tightened. "You're letting a traumatized veteran and his dog contaminate a facility." Nate said nothing. He had learned that men who tried to make you defend your sanity were often trying to move attention away from their own facts. Claire stepped toward Greer. The puppy Eli carried had a recent needle mark. This storage area was cleaned heavily. There's fur in a drain, scratches on a kennel, and a child's name behind those bags. "Start explaining." Greer looked at the letters on the wall, and for half a second his face opened. Not surprise, recognition. Then it closed again. "I don't manage overnight storage." "Who does?" Hannah asked. Greer glanced at Mara. Mara looked away. The records office gave them the next piece. Claire and Hannah pulled transfer logs from the past 8 months. The files were tidy, too tidy, with signatures in the right places and dates that lined up cleanly. Claire disliked them immediately. Real veterinary records carried small messes, notes in margins, corrections, follow-up reminders to call owners who never answered. These logs looked less like care and more like accounting. She found the first irregularity in a transfer form for a retired patrol dog listed as moved to a sanctuary in Montana. Its chip number appeared again 3 weeks later in a death report marked complications during transport. Then another. Then another. "Sheriff," Claire said quietly. Maddox came to her side. "Tell me it's clerical." "1 mistake is clerical. 4 is a system." Nate stood behind them, Atlas at his knee. Claire turned another page and stopped. The reference code in the margin was not Atlas's current chip, but an old service file code tied to his military transfer history. Nate knew the sequence because it had appeared on Atlas's discharge paperwork. For a moment, the office seemed to tilt. "That's Atlas," he said. Claire shook her head slowly. "Not exactly. It's a reference code. Someone used part of his old service identity to validate a different dog's movement." "Meaning?" Maddox asked. Claire looked at Nate, and her voice softened without becoming gentle. "Meaning Atlas wasn't declared dead, but his history may have been used like a cover sheet. Another dog could disappear under a name connected to him." Nate looked down at Atlas. The dog looked back, eyes steady, unaware of paperwork, aware only of the people in the room and the tension in Nate's hand. Nate had thought war ended when the transport plane brought them home. Now a file in a small-town K9 center was telling him that pieces of that war had followed them into the snow. The final disruption came in the form of a polished black SUV turning into the lot outside. Mara saw it through the office window and closed her eyes for one brief second. A man stepped out wearing a dark navy tailored overcoat over a charcoal suit, white dress shirt, dark burgundy tie, polished black leather shoes, and a black steel ring on his right hand. Victor Sloan was in his early 50s, tall, controlled, with silver-gray hair neatly combed back, pale blue calculating eyes, and a clean-shaven face arranged into practiced concern. He walked like a man used to entering troubled rooms and deciding which version of the truth would leave with him. "Sheriff Maddox," Sloan said warmly when he entered. "I came as soon as Mara called." "I understand there's been a misunderstanding." Maddox did not shake his hand. "That depends on what you understand." Sloan turned to Nate, his eyes resting on the uniform, then Atlas. "Mr. Rourke, I've heard of you. Red Ash owes you more gratitude than you allow anyone to give." It was a clever opening. Compliment first, control second. Nate did not answer. Sloan smiled faintly, then looked at the files on the desk. "This center has saved dozens of animals that nobody else wanted. I would hate for grief, rumor, and old trauma to damage good work." There it was. Not an accusation, not openly, but enough to place Nate's mind on trial. Maddox heard it too. Claire's jaw tightened. Hannah shifted her stance, eyes on Sloan's right hand. Atlas moved then. Not much, just one step forward. His head lowered, ears sharp, gaze locked on Sloan. The room became aware of him, the way people become aware of a storm warning. Sloan's smile did not vanish, but it froze at the edges. "Beautiful dog," he said. Atlas growled, low and controlled. Nate placed one hand lightly on the tan vest, not to restrain him, only to tell him he had been heard. Sloan looked from the dog to Nate. Military animals can carry strong associations. Sometimes they react to things that aren't there. Nate's voice was quiet. Sometimes they react to things people hope stay hidden. Nobody spoke after that for several seconds. Maddox collected copies of the transfer forms. Claire bagged the fur sample, and Hannah photographed the scratched letters behind the feed bags. Mara stood near the rear door, smaller now than she had been at the start, a woman trapped between fear and exposure. Greer kept tapping his pen until Claire snapped, "Stop." He stopped. Sloan remained composed, offering cooperation in sentences that said nothing. He insisted the records could be explained, that subcontracted transport sometimes caused duplicated codes, that old military file references often created confusion when animals moved between programs. The explanations were smooth enough to sound prepared. That made Nate trust them less. As they left the center, the sun was dropping behind the pines, turning the snow blue. Atlas paused at the rear storage door and looked back once, not at Sloan, not at Greer, but at the kennel where the fur had been found. Nate followed his gaze and imagined a dog in that cage, a dog given another dog's name, a dog erased without dying. Maddox came to stand beside him. "You still think this is bigger than a runaway kid?" Nate looked at the main building with its cheerful sign, then at the storage shed behind it. "I think this place has two faces." Maddox nodded slowly. "And we just saw the one it doesn't show donors." Across the lot, Sloan watched them from near his SUV, black ring resting against the door handle, face calm as winter glass. Atlas growled once more, softer this time, and Nate felt the sound in his bones. The recovery center had not given them answers. It had given them proof that answers existed, and somewhere behind paperwork, disinfectant, and polite smiles, something living had been taken, renamed, and hidden. Nate Rourke did not drive straight home after leaving Red Ash K9 Recovery Center. He sat in his truck at the edge of the center's parking lot for nearly 3 minutes, engine running, one hand resting on the wheel, the other on Atlas's tan vest. Snow gathered along the windshield in thin white lines. Across the lot, the main building glowed warm and harmless, a place with donation posters and thank you letters in the front windows, while the rear storage shed sat half hidden behind it like a second thought. Nate kept seeing the scratched letters behind the feed bags. Eli. He kept hearing Victor Sloan's polished voice, the way the man had spoken about trauma, as if it were a stain on Nate's judgment, instead of a wound earned in service. But what stayed deepest was the file Claire had found, the old service reference tied to Atlas being used to validate another dog's disappearance. Names like Coates, put one on, take one off, make a dog disappear. Eli's words were too strange to be invented by a frightened child. Atlas sat in the passenger seat, upright and still, dark amber eyes fixed on the rear shed until Nate finally put the truck in gear. "Not yet," Nate said quietly. Atlas did not look at him. Nate understood. A good dog could obey a command and still know the command was late. By evening, the storm had thinned, but the cold hardened. Red Ash Valley became all blue shadows, frozen gutters, and porch lights glowing through drifting snow. Nate followed Claire's advice and did not go back to the recovery center. Instead, he went to the small veterinary clinic on Ash Mill Road, where Dr. Mason Greer worked after hours when he wanted to avoid people. The clinic was a low brick building with a faded sign, 2 exam rooms, and a rear kennel wing that smelled of antiseptic, old towels, and anxious animals. The parking lot held only one truck, Greer's. Nate parked at the far edge and stepped out with Atlas beside him. The Belgian Malinois moved without sound, head level, body controlled. This was not an attack. This was a question given 4 legs and teeth. Nate entered without knocking because the front door was unlocked, and because men hiding behind procedure often forgot ordinary doors. Greer looked up from behind the reception counter. The veterinarian seemed even thinner under the fluorescent lights than he had at the center. He had a pale, lined face, deep-set gray eyes, short graying hair combed badly as if he had run his fingers through it too many times, and a clean-shaven jaw that trembled slightly before he tightened it. He wore the same dark charcoal veterinary coat over a light blue button-up shirt, dark brown trousers, black practical shoes, and clinic ID badge. There was a clipboard in front of him, but he was not reading it. "You can't be here," Greer said. "The sheriff told you not to interfere." Nate placed a copy of the transfer form on the counter. "Which dog did Graham Turner help you move?" Greer stared at the paper. "Leave." "Which dog? You people hear what you want to hear." "No," Nate said. "I've spent years hearing things I didn't want to hear. Answer the question." Greer's eyes flicked to Atlas. That was the first crack. Not fear of being bitten. Something older. Something personal. Atlas stepped forward only once, then stopped. He did not growl. He only watched Greer with the focused stillness of a working dog, trained to read what men tried to bury under words. Greer swallowed. "That animal should not be in my clinic. He's calmer than you are." Greer's hand tightened around the pen. "You think because you wore a uniform, every locked file is a conspiracy? You think every mistake in a record is some grand betrayal? You are not the first veteran to come home needing an enemy." Nate felt the sentence strike the old bruise, exactly where Greer wanted it. The world had used that argument on him before. Trauma made you unreliable, grief made you dramatic, survival made you suspicious. Nate could have raised his voice. He could have stepped closer. Instead, he stayed still. That unsettled Greer more than anger would have. "I'm not here because of what I imagine," Nate said. "I'm here because a child froze under a bridge holding a puppy with a needle mark. I'm here because my dog found that child's name scratched behind feed bags in your storage building. I'm here because your signature is on a transfer tied to Graham Turner before he died." Greer looked down. For a moment, he seemed like a man trying to hold a door shut, while floodwater rose behind it. A dog barked once from the rear kennel, then went silent. Greer flinched at the sound. Nate noticed. "You signed those papers." Greer's voice fell. "I signed many papers. That isn't an answer. It's the only one that won't ruin me." "You're already ruined," Nate said, not cruelly. "You're just deciding who else goes down with you." That did it. Greer set the pen down with careful precision. His shoulders dropped, and for the first time he looked less like a suspect than a tired man who had spent too long pretending guilt was paperwork. "It started as a rehabilitation study," he said. "That's what they called it. Retired K9 mobility tracking. Stress response mapping. Safer recovery plans for dogs with service trauma. Sloan came with money, legal documents, letters of support, people with old military titles. It looked legitimate." Nate said nothing. Atlas sat beside him, eyes on Greer. "The first dogs were old," Greer continued. "Arthritic, difficult to place. The data was supposed to help match them to homes. Then the shipments became irregular. Dogs listed as transferred before I examined them. Chip numbers reused. Sedation logs I didn't write but found under my access code. I questioned it. And my daughter's treatment bill was paid anonymously 2 days later." Greer looked up then, and whatever pride he had left seemed to hate the confession. Her name is Lily. She's 26. Autoimmune neurological disorder. Rare. Expensive. Sloan never said he paid it. He didn't have to. He only asked me if she was feeling stronger. His voice broke slightly on the last word. After that, every time I thought about reporting him, I saw my daughter in a hospital bed. Atlas moved before Nate did. The dog crossed the narrow space between them and stopped at the side of Greer's desk, nose lowering toward the bottom drawer. Greer's face changed so sharply it was almost an admission. "No," he whispered. Atlas did not open the drawer. He only placed one paw against it and looked back at Nate. For a second, the clinic seemed to hold its breath. Nate stepped around the counter and pulled the drawer open. Inside was not money, not drugs, not anything dramatic. It was a child's thank you card, folded once, with a shaky drawing of an old dog wearing a blue collar. Beneath the drawing were the words, "Thank you for helping Ranger breathe again." Nate looked at Greer. The veterinarian's eyes were wet now, though no tears fell. "He was the first one I couldn't find afterward," Greer said. "I kept that card because I wanted to remember I had been a good doctor once." Atlas lowered his head, almost gently, as if the dog understood that guilt had a scent too. Greer told the rest in pieces. Graham Turner had come to him 3 months before the accident, with questions about duplicated transport codes. Graham had worked logistics long enough to know the difference between confusion and concealment. He had found dogs listed as dead in one system and transferred in another. He had also found something stranger, old service identities being used as reference shells for dogs that never reached their destination. Atlas's former file code had appeared in one such shell. "Graham thought your dog's history made the transfer look clean," Greer said. "A decorated K9, discharged properly, paperwork already trusted. They weren't saying Atlas was dead. They were using pieces of his file like a stamp." Nate looked down at Atlas, and the old anger rose cold and precise. His dog had come home from war, only to be used as camouflage for another dog's disappearance. "What were they putting in those dogs?" Nate asked. Greer hesitated. "Biometric tracking devices, some external, some implanted during procedures disguised as medical repairs. Heart rate, stress response, location, motion pattern, recovery data. The kind of information contractors can sell as field performance intelligence. To the military? To companies that sell to the military." Greer's answer was careful, and that made it worse. Graham believed some devices from the same development line had failed in high-interference environments. Bad location data, delayed signal correction. He said the reports were being cleaned before review. Nate's hand tightened around the edge of the counter. A room in another country flashed in his mind. Dust, broken concrete, the green pulse of a screen, showing a safe path that had not been safe at all. He forced the memory back behind his teeth. Did Graham have proof? Enough to scare him, not enough to protect him. Greer opened a locked cabinet in the rear office and removed a small envelope. Inside were photocopies of partial transfer sheets, handwritten notes, and a photograph of Graham Turner standing beside a dented blue pickup truck. Graham was a lean American man in his early 40s, with a work-worn build, short dark brown hair touched with gray at the temples, light stubble, and worried hazel eyes. He wore a faded olive work jacket over a dark gray flannel shirt, rugged jeans, and brown work boots. In the photograph, he looked like a man trying to appear ordinary while carrying something heavy inside him. "He left these with me," Greer said. "Said if anything happened, I should give them to someone outside the center." Nate took the photograph. "You didn't." "No." Greer's shame was blunt now. "I told myself the accident was an accident. I told myself Graham drove too fast on ice. I told myself a lot of things, because the alternative meant I had let him stand alone." Nate wanted to hate him cleanly, but grief had made him suspicious of clean emotions. Greer was guilty. Greer was weak. Greer was also terrified and human, which made the damage harder to hold. "Where is the rest?" Nate asked. Greer shook his head. "Graham didn't trust me with the main evidence. He said if he vanished, the dogs would know where to look." "That's not an answer. It's what he said." Atlas suddenly lifted his head. His ears angled toward the clinic window. Outside, headlights passed slowly along the street, too slowly for a normal car in this weather. Nate turned off the desk lamp with one hand and moved to the window edge. A dark pickup rolled by, no logo, no visible plate under the snow crust, then continued toward the county road. Greer's breathing changed. "They check sometimes," he whispered. "Who?" "I don't know their names." Nate looked at him. "You will." Nate called Deputy Hannah, not Maddox. He did it because Hannah had noticed the tracker, because she listened before deciding, and because Maddox would be obligated to bring Greer in immediately before Greer had finished braking. Hannah arrived 15 minutes later in her patrol vehicle, face set and hair tucked neatly under her winter cap. She listened to Greer's statement with her recorder on the table, asking precise questions and stopping him whenever he drifted into excuses. She was not unkind, but she refused to let guilt become fog. When Greer mentioned Graham's truck, Hannah looked at Nate. "It's still in the county impound lot." Nate felt Atlas shift beside him. The dog had gone still again, the way he had near the bridge. "Graham said the dogs would know where to look," Nate said. Hannah looked at Atlas, then at the storm-dark window. "Sheriff won't like us going tonight." "Then call him on the way." To her credit, Hannah did, Maddox argued, but not long. The discovery at the center, the tracker, and Greer's recorded statement gave them enough reason to inspect the vehicle under supervision. They drove to the county impound lot, a fenced gravel yard behind the sheriff's office where wrecked cars sat under snow like abandoned animals. Graham Turner's blue pickup was near the back, its front end crushed from the accident, windshield spiderwebbed, one headlight gone. Under the floodlights, it looked less like a vehicle and more like a question nobody had wanted to answer. Atlas pulled toward it before Nate released any slack. "Easy," Nate murmured. The dog circled once, sniffed the driver's door, the rear tire, the broken bumper, then stopped at the passenger side. He lowered his head and began pawing at the floorboard through the open door. Hannah shone her flashlight inside. "There's nothing there." Atlas pawed harder, not frantic, just certain. Nate climbed in carefully, pulled back the stained floor mat, then felt along the seam where the carpet met the metal frame. Something shifted beneath his fingers. A concealed panel, thin and well-fitted. He worked it loose with a pocket tool. Beneath it was a small waterproof metal box taped against the frame. Hannah photographed the box before Nate touched it. Then she opened an evidence pouch and nodded. Inside the metal box was an encrypted hard drive, a stack of printed chip lists, several photographs of dogs in transport crates, and a small digital recorder wrapped in cloth. Hannah played the recorder through her phone speaker. Static came first. Then Graham Turner's voice filled the cold air, quiet and strained. "If anyone finds this, don't start with the truck. Start with the dogs. They carry the truth in the records, on the skin, and in the names that were changed. Eli, if this reaches you, remember the second book. Birds mean numbers. Trees mean letters. Don't tell anyone who asks too nicely." The recording ended with a shaky breath, then silence. Nate looked at the hard drive, password protected. Hannah nodded slowly. The second book. Eli's second sketchbook, the one collected with his belongings at the shelter annex. Atlas stood beside the open truck door, snow collecting along his back, eyes fixed not on the box, but beyond the fence toward the road leading to town. Nate knew that look now. The trail had moved again. Somewhere near Eli, the next key was waiting. And if Graham had known enough to hide the password with his son, then someone else might know enough to look for it too. The metal box from Graham Turner's truck changed the temperature of the night without changing the weather. Snow still fell over the county impound lot, soft and patient, collecting on the hoods of wrecked cars and along the chain-link fence, but Nate Rourke felt something colder move through him as he looked at the encrypted hard drive in Deputy Hannah Vale's gloved hand. Graham's recorded voice had ended only seconds ago, yet it seemed to remain in the air. "Eli, remember the second book. Birds mean numbers. Trees mean letters. Don't tell anyone who asks too nicely." Nate stood beside the crushed blue pickup, Atlas at his left knee, and felt the shape of the trap before anyone said the word. The second sketchbook was with Eli's belongings at the county shelter annex. If Graham had hidden the password there, then Eli was no longer only a frightened boy who had seen too much. He was the living key to whatever Graham had died protecting. Hannah sealed the hard drive in an evidence bag, her sharp gray-blue eyes moving from the box to Nate's face. "We need to get to the annex," she said. Nate was already looking toward the road. "Call Maddox. I'm calling him now." Her voice stayed controlled, but he heard the urgency beneath it. Atlas turned his head toward the east, ears raised, nose working the frozen air. Nate had learned not to dismiss what Atlas noticed before people did. "What is it?" Hannah asked. Nate did not answer right away. Beyond the impound fence, far down the road toward the north end of town, a faint orange smear rose behind the pines. At first it could have been a porch light blurred by snow. Then the glow widened, pulsing against the low clouds. Hannah saw it too. Her radio cracked before she could speak. A dispatcher's voice came through, tense and clipped. "All units, structure fire reported at Red Ash K9 Recovery Center, rear storage building, possible arson. Sheriff Maddox responding." Hannah looked at Nate. Nate looked at Atlas. The dog's body had gone rigid. "That's not a coincidence," Nate said. By the time they reached the recovery center, the rear storage shed was bleeding smoke into the winter dark. Firefighters had already knocked down most of the flames, but the building's back corner was blackened and steaming, the air filled with the bitter smell of wet ash, melted plastic, and scorched cleaning chemicals. Red and blue lights flashed against the snow, turning the white ground into a restless field of color. Sheriff Cole Maddox stood near the fire line, broad shoulders squared under his dark brown sheriff jacket, his face harder than Nate had seen it before. Mara Whitcomb was wrapped in a blanket near an ambulance, her pale green eyes hollow and shocked, soot smudged along one cheek. "Doctor." Mason Greer stood several yards away, looking smaller than he had in his clinic, arms folded tightly, gray eyes fixed on the ruins as if he were watching the physical shape of his own cowardice burn. Victor Sloan had not arrived yet, which Nate found more troubling than if he had been standing at the center of everything with a prepared statement. Maddox met Nate near the tape. "You shouldn't be here. The fire started right after we found Graham's hard drive. I know what it looks like." "Do you?" Nate asked. Maddox's jaw tightened. Before he could answer, a firefighter called from the side of the shed. Hannah went over first, then turned back slowly, her expression changing. Nate knew before she spoke. In the snow, near the rear service door, laid too neatly for something supposedly dropped during panic, were a dark cloth, a folding utility knife, and a small metal tool case. Nate recognized all three. The cloth was from his truck, the knife was from his workshop. The tool case had sat under his bench 2 days ago. Maddox looked at the items, then at Nate. He did not look satisfied. He looked angry in the way a fair man looks when evidence tries to force him into an answer he does not trust. "Tell me those aren't yours," he said quietly. Nate looked at the objects on the snow. "They're mine." Around them, the firefighters moved, the radio crackled, Mara cried silently into the blanket, and the trap closed another inch. Sloan arrived 15 minutes later, stepping from his polished black SUV in the same dark navy overcoat, charcoal suit, burgundy tie, polished shoes, and black steel ring that caught the emergency lights whenever his hand moved. His silver-gray hair remained neat despite the weather, and his pale blue eyes carried the controlled sorrow of a man who knew exactly where cameras might be pointed. He went first to Mara, placing a careful hand on her shoulder, then to Maddox. Then, finally, he let his gaze settle on Nate. "This is a tragedy," Sloan said. "That building held medical supplies, donor records, adoption files. Things this community trusted us to protect," Maddox said. "We don't know the cause yet." Sloan's face tightened with a grief so polished it looked manufactured. "Sheriff, with respect, I was informed items belonging to Mr. Rourke were found near the point of origin." Nate felt Atlas shift beside him. The Belgian Malinois did not growl this time. He stared at Sloan with a stillness that made the air feel narrower. "You were informed fast," Hannah said. Sloan turned to her with mild surprise. "People are frightened, Deputy. They talk. The scene isn't public." A faint pause. Then Sloan gave a sad smile. "In a town this small, nothing stays private for long." The sentence sounded harmless. It was not. Within 20 minutes, 2 local reporters had arrived at the front gate. One was a thin man named Peter Lyle, a local stringer with a red nose, patchy beard, and an oversized parka, always hungry for a story large enough to carry him beyond the county website. Nate saw him lift a camera toward the fire, then toward the soldier in uniform standing just outside the tape. Sloan did not accuse Nate directly. He did worse. He spoke near the reporters about trauma, about stress, about good intentions twisted by old wounds, about how veterans deserved compassion even when they became confused by the past. Nate listened without moving. He had heard men weaponize pity before. Pity could ruin a man more quietly than hatred. Atlas suddenly left Nate's side and walked to the edge of the taped-off scene, not toward the burned shed, but toward a patch of snow beside the tire tracks. He lowered his head, sniffed once, then scraped gently with one paw. Hannah followed, flashlight down. Under a thin layer of fresh snow, half buried in slush, was a small piece of black rubber with a smear of red paint on one edge. It was not from Nate's truck. It matched neither the firefighter vehicles nor the sheriff's SUV. Atlas touched it with his nose, then looked past the fire trucks toward the dark road leading out behind the center. For one breath, Nate felt the whole night tilt. Someone had driven away from the rear shed after planting his belongings, and Atlas had found the one piece of that escape the fire had not swallowed. Maddox saw it too. He looked at Nate, and in his eyes was not belief yet, but resistance to the lie. Sometimes faith did not arrive as certainty. Sometimes it arrived as the refusal to accept the easiest wrong answer. That refusal was not enough to free Nate. Procedure had its own gravity. The arson scene, the planted items, the public pressure, and Sloane's careful performance forced Maddox's hand. "Nate," he said quietly, away from the reporters, "I have to bring you in." Hannah's head turned sharply. "Sheriff, I said bring him in, not charge him." Maddox's voice was low. "If I don't, Sloane controls the story by morning. If I do this by the book, I can slow it down." Nate understood that. He hated it, but he understood. He looked at Atlas. The dog's eyes were locked on him, reading the change in the air before the cuffs appeared. "He stays with me," Nate said. Maddox shook his head once. Not in holding. The words went through Nate cleanly. Not because he feared a cell. Cells were just rooms. It was the separation. The last time someone had taken Atlas out of Nate's sight in a system Nate did not trust, men had died before dawn. His breathing stayed even only because he forced it to. Hannah stepped closer. "I'll put Atlas in the K9 holding run at the station myself. Nobody touches him without me." Nate looked at her. She did not soften the promise. That made it stronger. "All right," he said. Maddox cuffed him in front, not behind. A small mercy, maybe, or an acknowledgement that Nate had not fought anyone. Sloane watched from near the ambulance, his expression arranged into concern. Nate looked back at him once and saw the truth beneath the mask. Sloane was not relieved. He was measuring how far the frame had worked. At the sheriff's station, Nate was placed in an interview room instead of a cell. The walls were beige, the table metal, the light too white. It smelled of coffee, paper, and old stress. Maddox sat across from him, recording on, questions careful. Where had Nate been before the fire? Why had his tools been missing? Who had access to his workshop? Nate answered what he could. He had been with Hannah at the impound lot. His workshop door had a lock, but anyone with time could force it. He had not checked his tools after returning from the recovery center. Maddox believed some of it. Nate could see that, but belief inside a man was not the same as evidence inside a file. Behind the interview room wall, Atlas was placed in the station's temporary K9 holding run, a clean concrete space used when county dogs needed short-term containment. Hannah gave him water, checked the latch twice, and stayed with him longer than required. Atlas did not drink. He stood facing the east wall, the direction of the county shelter annex. His ears remained forward. His body did not relax. Hannah watched him, then looked toward the hallway where Nate sat behind a closed door. Something about the dog's posture unsettled her more than the fire. Animals did not care about media stories. They did not care who looked guilty on paper. Atlas cared about direction. At the county shelter annex, Eli Turner sat in a small protected room with the puppy asleep in a crate beside him. The annex was a converted county building attached to the child welfare office, practical rather than warm, with cinder block walls painted pale yellow and old heating vents that rattled when the furnace kicked on. The woman assigned to watch him that night was Maribel Knox, a county child services worker in her late 50s with a round face, brown skin, silver-streaked black hair braided down her back, and a soft cardigan stretched over a floral blouse. Maribel had spent 30 years around frightened children, which had made her patient but not naive. She did not ask Eli too many questions. She gave him soup, dry socks, and permission to keep the puppy where he could see it. Eli's second sketchbook sat in a sealed belongings bin on a shelf across the room, logged by Hannah earlier but not yet examined. At 9:17 p.m., the building's heat failed in the east wing. 10 minutes later, a maintenance worker arrived, or seemed to. He was a narrow-shouldered man in his late 30s, with a pale face, light stubble, and a faded canvas jacket with a county contractor patch. He carried a toolbox and paperwork stamped with an authorization code. Maribel, annoyed by the cold and trusting the paperwork more than she should have, let him in after calling the front desk. The front desk confirmed a work order. That confirmation would later matter, because it meant the lie had entered the system before the man entered the building. Eli saw him through the window of the protected room and froze. The man's sleeve slid back when he set down the toolbox. On his wrist was a thin white scar, curved like a hook. Eli had drawn that scar before, in the first sketchbook, on the hand reaching toward a dog crate. Eli did not scream. Some children screamed when danger returned. Eli had learned from Graham to become small and useful to himself. He took the puppy from the crate, then remembered the second sketchbook, and looked toward the belongings shelf. The maintenance man was speaking softly to Maribel in the hall, too softly for Eli to hear. Then the man glanced through the room window and smiled. It was not a cruel smile. That made it worse. It was a smile meant to convince adults. Eli backed toward the laundry room door. Maribel noticed too late that the man was no longer looking at the thermostat. He was looking at the belongings bin. Eli slipped into the laundry room, shut the door carefully, and found the old wall phone near the supply shelf. His hand shook so badly he misdialed twice. On the third try, he called the number Hannah had written on a card and put in his pocket. "If scared, call me." The line connected. "Deputy Vale," Hannah answered. Eli whispered, "Sketchbook. He's here." "Eli?" The man from the drawings. A sound came from the hall. A knock. Soft and friendly. "Eli," the man called. "Your father wanted me to help you." Eli pressed the phone closer. "He has the scar." Then the laundry room door handle moved. The line crackled as Eli dropped the receiver into a basket of towels. Hannah was already running before the call fully died. She burst into the corridor outside the interview room and nearly collided with Maddox. "The annex," she said. Eli called. "Someone's inside. Fake maintenance. Scar on wrist. Going for the sketchbook." Maddox's face changed completely. Not suspicion now. Command. He keyed his radio, ordered units to the annex, then looked toward the K9 holding run. Atlas had begun to growl, not loudly, steadily. He was facing the door, body forward, every muscle asking for release. Maddox looked at Nate through the interview room glass. The easy legal answer was to keep the suspect locked down and send deputies. But the night had stopped offering easy answers hours ago. There was a child in danger, a dog trained to track, and a man who understood that dog better than anyone alive. Maddox opened the interview room door. Nate stood before being told. "Eli? Maybe." Maddox unlocked one cuff from the table but kept the other on Nate's wrist. "You are not free. You are assisting under my authority. Hannah supervises you. You do exactly what I say." Nate's eyes went to Atlas beyond the hall. "Open the run." Maddox held his gaze. "If you run, I won't. If this is a trick, it isn't." Maddox looked at him for one more second, then nodded to Hannah. She opened the K9 run. Atlas came out like an arrow given permission. Not wild, not uncontrolled, but focused so completely the hallway seemed to clear around him. They did not reach the annex in time to catch the fake maintenance man inside. Maribel was shaken but unharmed, sitting in the hallway with a deputy beside her, blaming herself in a trembling voice. The belongings bin was open. The second sketchbook was gone. So was Eli. For a moment, Nate felt the floor drop away beneath him. Then Atlas moved to the laundry room, sniffed the floor, the towels, the back exit, and found the trail. Hannah recovered the dropped phone. Maddox cursed once, quietly, then called in the abduction. Nate said nothing. Words were too slow. Atlas moved out the rear door into the freezing rain that had begun to fall over the snow, nose low, body set. He crossed the service alley, past the dumpsters, ignored the tire tracks near the main road, and angled toward the wooded path behind the annex. He didn't take him by car from the front, Hannah said. He walked him out back. Or Eli ran and got followed, Nate said. Atlas paused at the tree line, lifted his head, and looked toward the old industrial road beyond town, the one that led to the abandoned sawmill property. Nate felt the next piece of the night lock into place. The recovery center, Graham's truck, the false fire, the stolen sketchbook, Eli's disappearance. All of it was moving to the same dark point. Maddox stood behind him, breathing hard in the cold. Where is he going? Nate kept his hand on Atlas's vest as the dog leaned toward the black road ahead. To the place they thought nobody would look. Atlas pulled forward. This time, no one told him to stop. Atlas led them away from the county shelter annex and into the black road beyond town, as if the night itself had given him a line only he could see. Freezing rain fell over the snow, turning the path behind the building into a slick ribbon of mud, ice, and crushed pine needles. Nate Rourke moved beside the Belgian Malinois with one cuff still locked around his left wrist, and Deputy Hannah Vale close enough to keep him officially under supervision, though neither of them pretended the metal mattered now. Sheriff Cole Maddox followed with a flashlight in one hand and his radio in the other, calling for backup while trying not to lose sight of the dog. Dr. Claire Hensley came behind them carrying a compact medical kit and a handheld chip scanner she had grabbed from her truck before leaving the station. Nobody spoke more than necessary. Eli Turner was missing. The second sketchbook was gone. The man with the scar had slipped through a protected building using false paperwork. And Atlas, who had first found Eli under the bridge, was now pulling them toward the old industrial road that led to the abandoned sawmill north of Red Ash Valley. The sawmill had been closed for 12 years, a place of collapsed loading ramps, rusted conveyors, and long buildings where the wind moved through broken boards like a living thing. People in town said teenagers used to dare each other to go there at night. Nate had never gone. He had seen enough abandoned buildings in his life to know they were never empty in the way people hoped. The first sign was not light. It was sound. Atlas stopped at the edge of the tree line and lowered his head. Nate heard it a moment later, a low mechanical hum from somewhere beyond the pines. Not loud enough to carry to the main road, but steady enough to mean power. The sawmill should have had none. Maddox crouched near a fallen branch, breath white in the cold. There shouldn't be electricity out here. Hannah aimed her flashlight down and found tire tracks pressed into the slush, fresher than the storm, several sets. Claire touched one track with the toe of her boot. Heavy vehicle, maybe a van or transport truck. Atlas moved again, slower now, mission-focused. Nate placed 2 fingers lightly on the dog's vest, not holding him back, only keeping contact. The old road opened into a clearing where the sawmill squatted under the storm clouds, long and dark, with a newer metal side door set into the weathered wall. Faint light showed through a crack near the bottom. Nate studied the layout without thinking. Main building, side entrance, rear loading bay, 2 outbuildings, 1 access road, tree cover to the west, frozen drainage ditch to the east. He felt the old part of himself wake, the part that read danger without asking permission from fear. But this was not a battlefield, and Eli was not a target. Nate forced himself to breathe. The mission was simple: find the boy, preserve the evidence, get everyone out alive. Maddox whispered into his radio, updating approaching units to hold without sirens. Hannah checked the rear approach. Claire stayed low beside a broken stack of lumber, scanning the building with the narrowed eyes of someone listening not for people, but for animals. "I hear dogs," she said. Nate looked at her. "How many?" "More than one." "Weak." Inside, Atlas heard them too. His ears angled toward the left wing of the sawmill, and a low tremor moved through his chest. Not the sharp warning he had given at Sloan. This sound was different, grief with teeth. Nate nodded once to Maddox. "We go in quiet." Maddox looked at the cuff on Nate's wrist, then at the building. The sheriff's face carried the exhausted conflict of a man trying to obey procedure while reality kept outrunning the manual. "You stay behind, Hannah." "Fine. You do not engage anyone unless Eli is in immediate danger." Nate's eyes stayed on the door. "Fine." Hannah glanced at him, hearing the discipline in his voice and the storm underneath it. She had seen angry men before, Nate was not angry in the usual way. He was holding something back with both hands. They entered through the side door after Maddox found it unlatched. The interior smelled of old sawdust, wet metal, dog stress, and chemical disinfectant. Portable work lights had been set up along the main floor, throwing harsh white circles across machinery that had not moved in years. Crates were stacked near the wall. Some were empty. Some held folded restraints, scanners, sealed pouches, transport tags, and veterinary supplies. Claire's face hardened as she examined a tray of labeled syringes. "These aren't from a rescue center," she whispered. "This is controlled handling." Atlas pulled left, toward a row of interior offices converted into temporary rooms. They heard Eli before they saw him. Not a scream. A small, choked protest. Nate's entire body changed. Hannah felt it and put a hand against his arm, not restraining him, reminding him where he was. Maddox stepped to the first office door and pushed it open. Empty. The second held paperwork, a portable printer, and a torn county maintenance patch lying on a table. The third door was locked from the outside with a sliding bolt. Atlas pressed his nose to the bottom gap and whined once. Nate did not wait for permission. He slid the bolt back and opened the door. Eli was inside, sitting on the floor with his knees drawn to his chest, pale and shaking but alive. His dark navy beanie was gone, his brown hair damp against his forehead, and his small hands were wrapped around the second sketchbook, as if it were the only solid thing left in the world. For a second, Eli did not move. Fear had taught him to measure every rescue before trusting it. Then, Atlas stepped past Nate and lowered his head. Eli made a broken sound and reached for the dog's neck. Atlas stood still, letting the boy bury his face against the tan vest. Nate crouched in the doorway, keeping his voice low. "You hurt?" Eli shook his head, then nodded, then shook again. "He said Dad wanted him to have the book." "The man with the scar?" Hannah asked. Eli nodded. "He knew my dad's name. He knew what page had the birds." Claire quickly checked him for visible injury, careful and gentle. "Cold, scared, bruised wrist, no major trauma," she said. "We need to get him out." Eli grabbed Nate's sleeve with sudden force. "No, the dogs are here." Nate looked at him. "What dogs?" Eli pointed toward the left wing. "The ones Dad said weren't dead." The building creaked around them. Somewhere deeper inside, a dog gave a weak bark, then another answered, hoarse and tired. Atlas turned toward the sound. The relief in Eli's face vanished, replaced by something far older than his age. They were going to move them tonight. Eli opened the second sketchbook with trembling hands and flipped to a page filled with birds, trees, and strange little circles. "Dad said if I forgot the numbers, the birds would remember," he whispered. Claire looked over his shoulder, then at the encrypted drive Hannah had carried in an evidence pouch. The page was not a child's random drawing, it was a key. 3 sparrows beside a pine, 2 crows over a crooked branch, a row of tiny trees shaped like letters. Graham Turner had hidden a password inside his son's memory, not because he wanted Eli involved, but because he knew adults could search pockets and drawers and hard drives, while no one thought to search the way a grieving child drew birds. Hannah's eyes softened. "Your dad was trying to protect the truth." Eli looked at Atlas, still beside him. "No," he said quietly. "He was trying to protect the dogs." They moved fast after that, but not carelessly. Hannah used the sketchbook key to unlock a portion of Graham's hard drive on a laptop found in the office. Files opened in layers, transfer logs, chip registries, transport invoices, veterinary procedure notes, and photographs of K9s in crates. Claire scanned the first records, her jaw tight. Some of these dogs were listed as deceased. She clicked another file, but they were moved through shell rescues after the death entry. Maddox stood behind her, reading over her shoulder. "Can this hold up?" Hannah asked. "If chain of custody is clean and we preserve the device, yes," Maddox said. "But we need the physical dogs if they're here." Atlas had already gone to the left wing door. Nate followed with Eli close behind until Claire stopped the boy. "Stay with me." Eli's eyes filled with panic. "I can help." "You already did," Claire said. "Now let us do our part." That sentence seemed to reach him. He nodded and clutched the sketchbook to his chest. The left wing had once held cutting equipment. Now it held cages. 5 transport kennels stood under portable lights. 2 were empty. 3 held dogs. One was a gray-muzzled shepherd mix, who lifted his head weakly. Another was a dark Belgian Malinois, with a bandaged foreleg. The third was an elderly male Belgian Malinois K9, around 9 or 10 years old, thin and weakened, with a faded fawn coat, darker patches along the shoulders, a graying black facial mask, tired amber eyes, and slightly lowered ears. He wore only an old brown working dog collar. No vest. No tag. No name anyone had bothered to preserve. He tried to stand when Atlas approached, failed, then stretched his nose through the kennel bars. Atlas touched noses with him and went completely still. Nate felt the silence move through the room. It was not the silence of fear. It was recognition between soldiers who had never met but understood the same language of service. Claire knelt beside the old Malinois and scanned him. The chip reader beeped. She looked at the number, then back at the file on Hannah's tablet. "This is the dog," she said. Nate turned. "What dog?" Claire swallowed. "The one hidden under Atlas's old reference code." Maddox muttered something under his breath. Hannah's face went pale. The old dog closed his eyes as Atlas remained pressed close to the bars, steady as a vow. Claire scanned the old dog again, slower this time, then took out a smaller handheld detector from her kit. "There's something else." The device chirped near the left flank. She parted the faded fur and found a small surgical scar under the skin. "Implant site," she said. "Not a standard microchip location." Nate looked at the scar, and the room narrowed. Tracking device? Likely biometric tracker. Could be passive until activated. Hannah cross-checked the device code from Graham's files. The prefix matches one of the equipment lines in the reports. Nate's ears caught only part of her sentence because memory had surged up. Dust in his mouth, coordinates glowing green, a voice saying the route was clear. Then, the first blast of wrongness. Not an explosion in this moment, but the knowledge that the map had lied. He steadied himself with one hand against a support beam. Atlas looked back at him, as if feeling the shift. Nate forced the memory down. "Does it connect to my mission?" His voice sounded distant even to himself. Hannah did not answer too quickly. "Not proven. Same development line. Maybe same contractor chain. We need confirmation." Claire looked at him with compassion that did not pity him. "This is a lead, Nate. Not the whole truth yet." He nodded. It mattered that she said it that way. He had lived too long with people turning suspicion into certainty when it suited them. A vehicle door slammed outside. Maddox moved to the broken window and looked through a gap in the boards. Company. Victor Sloan had arrived, not alone this time. Beside him stood the scarred man from the shelter annex, and another broad man in a dark utility jacket carrying a hard case. Sloan's polished comm looked strained at the edges now, but not broken. He entered the sawmill through the loading bay, as if he owned the air. "Sheriff," he called, voice echoing through the old building. "This has gone far enough." Maddox stepped into view but kept his distance. "You're standing inside an active crime scene." Sloan gave a thin smile. "I own a minority stake in the property through a holding company. I'm standing inside a legal asset that has been unlawfully entered." Hannah leaned toward Nate and whispered, "He's already building defense." Nate watched Sloan's right hand, the black steel ring visible when he gestured. "Where is the boy?" Sloan asked. "Safe," Maddox said. "That word gets used too easily." "You'd know," Nate said. Sloan's eyes shifted to him. "Mr. Rourke, I understand your need to make sense of old pain, but this is not a battlefield. You don't get to invent enemies because grief requires a face." The words were almost identical in shape to the ones Greer had used. Nate understood then how Sloan worked. He did not merely hide evidence. He gave frightened people language to doubt themselves. Before Sloan could say more, another vehicle rolled into the clearing. Not a patrol car, a dark government sedan, followed by a county unit. An older man stepped out into the freezing rain, tall and upright despite his age, with a lean military build, stern-lined face, short silver hair, deep-set steel-gray eyes, and a clean-shaven jaw set with the weight of old authority. He wore a dark gray wool overcoat over a plain navy sweater, pressed khaki trousers, black leather boots, and a simple military academy ring. Colonel Adrian Pike, retired, did not hurry, but every step said he had spent a lifetime entering rooms where hesitation cost lives. Maddox looked surprised. Hannah looked relieved. Nate had seen the name once in old contract paperwork. Pike looked first at Nate, then at Atlas, then at the old Malinois behind the kennel bars. His face changed only slightly, but the change carried shame. "I was sent the preliminary files," Pike said. His voice was low, gravelly, and controlled. "The equipment prefix on that implant belongs to a development line I helped approve 8 years ago." Sloane's expression sharpened. "Colonel, I would caution you against making statements without counsel present." Pike did not look at him. He looked at Nate. "I approved reports because the reports were clean. Too clean. I should have asked why." Nate said nothing. Pike's eyes lowered for a moment. "I believed paper over people in the field. And men may have paid for it." The broad man with the hard case moved while everyone's attention held on Pike. Atlas saw him first. The man slipped toward a side table where a compact data drive sat connected to a portable receiver, its indicator light blinking. Hannah turned, but Atlas was already moving. He crossed the floor in a controlled burst, not a wild attack, not rage, but trained interception. The man tried to lift the drive case. Atlas hit the space in front of him, jaws open in warning, body low and powerful. The man froze, then tried to pivot away. Atlas caught the sleeve and drove him into the wall hard enough to stop him without tearing him apart. Maddox and Hannah closed in, securing the man and the data drive. Nate had not moved. That mattered. He had wanted to. Every old instinct told him to end the threat with his own hands. Instead, he watched Atlas do exactly what a good K9 did. Stop the danger, preserve the evidence, stay within command. Sloane looked at the scene, and for the first time his mask cracked enough to show anger, not fear. Anger that a dog had interrupted a plan made by men who thought themselves above animals. Maddox turned to him. "Victor Sloane, you're coming with us for questioning." Sloane lifted his chin. "Am I under arrest?" "Not yet." Maddox's voice was steady. "But if you walk away from this scene, you will be." Outside, backup units arrived without sirens. The dogs were documented, the files secured, and Claire began stabilizing the old Malinois, while Atlas refused to leave the kennel. Eli was brought carefully from the office, only after the scene was safe enough, wrapped in Hannah's spare jacket, second sketchbook, still against his chest. When he saw the old dog, he stopped. "That's him," he whispered. Nate looked down. "You know this dog?" Eli nodded. "Dad called him the dog with no name. He said if we found him, people would have to listen." The old Malinois opened his tired amber eyes as Atlas stood beside him, younger and stronger, the past and present divided by kennel bars. Nate crouched beside Eli. For the first time that night, the boy leaned against him without flinching. Across the room, Pike stared at the implant scanner as if it were a judgment. Sloane stood between two deputies, still polished, still calculating, not defeated but finally contained by something stronger than his language. Nate rested one hand on Atlas's back. He had not found the whole truth about his old mission. Not yet, but he had found proof that the official story had cracks. He had found Eli alive. He had found the dog hidden under Atlas's stolen shadow. And in the cold belly of an abandoned sawmill, surrounded by cages and records and men who had tried to make living things disappear, Nate felt the first fragile shift inside him. Maybe the truth had not died with his team. Maybe it had only been waiting for a dog stubborn enough to follow the scent. By sunrise, the abandoned sawmill no longer looked like a forgotten place. It looked like a wound finally opened to daylight. County deputies moved in and out of the old loading bay with evidence bags. Portable lights hummed against the gray morning, and the freezing rain had turned the dirt road into a hard, shining ribbon of mud and ice. Victor Sloane was not dragged away like a defeated villain in a storybook. He stood beside a patrol vehicle in his dark navy overcoat, silver gray hair still neat, pale blue eyes still calculating, speaking calmly to an attorney over the phone while two deputies watched him. Even contained, he tried to control the shape of the room. He told Maddox he had invested in the property through a holding company. He said he had never approved illegal animal handling. He said any experimental program must have been mismanaged by subcontractors. He said the word misunderstanding 3 times before Sheriff Cole Maddox finally took the phone from his hand and told him, "You can explain that downtown." Nate Rourke stood several yards away, one cuff still around his wrist, but no longer attached to anything. The metal felt strange now, almost meaningless. Around him, the truth was becoming physical. Graham Turner's hard drive, the second sketchbook, the transport records, the hidden K9, the implant scan. The data drive Atlas had stopped from leaving the building. Paper could lie for years, but paper had finally met bodies, scars, cages, and a boy who remembered what adults tried to erase. The old Belgian Malinois was carried out first. Doctor Claire Hensley walked beside the stretcher with the steady focus of a veterinarian who had put her emotions behind her hands because the animal still needed her more than her grief. The old K9, around 10 years old, thin and exhausted, with a faded fawn coat and graying black mask, lifted his head just enough to find Atlas. Atlas moved to the stretcher and touched his nose to the older dog's muzzle. It was a small gesture, quiet enough that most people missed it, but Nate felt it strike deeper than any statement made that morning. The younger K9 in the tan tactical vest and the nameless old dog in the worn brown collar stood on opposite sides of the same stolen history. One had been used as a cover in a file. The other had carried the evidence in his body. Eli Turner watched from inside Hannah Vale's jacket, his small face pale with shock and relief, the second sketchbook still pressed against his chest. He whispered, "Dad said, if we found him, people would have to listen." Nate looked at the boy and answered the only true thing he had. "They're listening now." Colonel Adrian Pike did not leave after the first statements were taken. He remained near the evidence table, tall and upright in his dark gray wool overcoat, face lined with a kind of disciplined regret that did not ask anyone to comfort it. He reviewed the device code from the implant and the old contract prefixes with Hannah and Maddox, then made 2 calls that changed the investigation from a county case into something larger. By noon, the first federal contacts had responded. Sloan Recovery Systems' government-linked contracts were flagged for audit. The holding company tied to the sawmill was frozen. The equipment line that matched the old Malinois implant and Nate's mission-era reports was pulled for review. None of it brought back the dead. Nate knew better than to let bureaucracy feel like resurrection. But movement mattered. For years, the official story had sat like a stone on his chest. Wrong coordinates, hostile contact, unavoidable loss. Now there was a crack in the stone. Maybe not enough to free him, but enough to let air in. Dr. Mason Greer gave his first full statement that afternoon. He sat in the sheriff's conference room, thinner than before, hands folded, gray eyes fixed on the table because he could not yet look everyone in the face. He admitted to signing transfer records he had not personally verified, allowing access under his medical credentials, and staying silent after he suspected dogs were being altered, moved, or renamed. He also named payment routes tied to his daughter Lily's medical bills, not as an excuse, but as the chain Sloan had used to pull him deeper. Maddox listened without softness. Hannah documented every word. Claire stood near the wall, arms crossed, angry in the quiet way of people who heal living things and cannot forgive easily those who let them suffer. Greer was not arrested that day, but he was suspended from practice pending investigation and ordered to cooperate. When he passed Nate in the hallway, he stopped and said, "I thought silence would protect my family." Nate looked at him. "It protected the wrong people." Greer nodded as if the sentence had been expected and deserved. "I know." That evening, Claire called Nate to the clinic. The old Malinois had been sedated for imaging, and the implant had been removed from beneath a small scar in his left flank. Claire placed the device in a clear evidence container, no larger than a coin, clean and terrible under the exam light. Atlas stood beside Nate, looking not at the device, but at the old dog sleeping on the padded table. Then Atlas did something Nate had never seen him do around another working dog. He lowered himself to the floor, rested his chin on the table's metal footrail, and stayed perfectly still, as if keeping watch through a dream the older dog could not finish alone. Claire's voice softened. "He knows." Nate stared at the old dog's shallow but steady breathing. "Knows what?" Claire looked at him. "That someone finally came back for him." Nate felt the words enter a place in him he had kept locked for years. Someone finally came back. He had spent half his life believing he had failed to do exactly that. 2 days later, Rebecca Hale arrived in Red Ash Valley. Nate saw her from across the small courthouse parking lot before she saw him. She was an American woman, 42 years old, slender but strong in posture, with a pale, tired face, clear blue eyes carrying restrained grief, and shoulder-length dark blonde hair tucked into the collar of a long dark gray wool coat. She wore a black turtleneck, dark jeans, brown leather boots, and a simple silver wedding ring on her left hand. In her gloved fingers, she held an old, folded military photograph. Rebecca was the widow of Daniel Hale, one of the men who had died in Nate's final mission. Years earlier, she had looked at Nate after the funeral and asked why he came home when Daniel did not. Nate had never blamed her for the question. He had asked himself the same thing every morning since. Now she stood in front of him with the photograph between them like a piece of weather neither could avoid. "Colonel Pike called me," she said. Her voice was controlled, but control cost her. "He said the equipment review may change what we were told." Nate nodded. "Maybe. Not proof yet?" "Not all of it." Rebecca looked away toward the courthouse steps, where Pike was speaking with Maddox. "I hated you for surviving." Nate did not answer. She looked back at him, eyes bright but dry. "I don't know how to apologize for that without making it about me." "You don't have to. I do." Her fingers tightened around the photograph. "I don't know if I can forgive the world yet. I don't know if I can forgive the people who signed papers and called it done. But I know you should not have been the only one carrying it." Nate had no defense against that. A battle-trained man could survive noise, impact, hunger, fear. Kindness was harder. His throat tightened. Daniel was better than the report they wrote. Rebecca's face changed then. Not healed, not fixed, but seen. "So were all of them," she said. Nate nodded. "Yeah." They were. In the weeks that followed, Red Ash Valley changed by inches, not miracles. Sloan did not confess in one dramatic moment. He denied, deflected, blamed contractors, blamed Greer, blamed record confusion, blamed anyone but himself. But evidence kept narrowing the space around him. The financial trail showed he knew about failed device tests. Graham's files proved dogs had been moved after false death entries. The old Malinois implant connected the local operation to a broader equipment line. Pike testified that reports used for approval had been incomplete and unusually clean. Hannah's camera logs showed the fake maintenance entry at the shelter annex. Atlas's intervention had preserved the data drive Sloan's man tried to remove. Finally, Sloan was charged with multiple offenses tied to fraud, evidence tampering, and illegal animal testing. The words were legal and dry. They did not capture the sound of Eli under the bridge, or the old K9 trying to stand, or Nate waking from years of guilt, but they were words the system could use. Sometimes, that was how justice began, not with thunder, but with usable language. Mara Whitcomb kept the front gate of Red Ash K9 Recovery Center closed for nearly a month. When she finally reopened it, the old sign had been taken down. The new one was plain, almost humble. Red Ash K9 Recovery and Veterans Support, Independent Oversight Program. Mara had agreed to testify about Sloan's pressure and her own failure to ask hard questions soon enough. She was not forgiven by everyone. She did not. Eli visited often, usually with Hannah nearby. The puppy he had saved under the bridge recovered into a small, lively creature with tangent and cream fur and floppy ears, still nervous around strangers but devoted to Eli. The boy named him Scout because, as Eli said, he found trouble before anyone else believed it was there. Atlas tolerated Scout with solemn patience, allowing the puppy to bounce near his paws as long as mission boundaries were respected. Nate's cabin changed too. Not all at once. At first, it was just Eli dropping off a drawing, then Claire leaving medication for Atlas's sore joints after long searches. Then Maddox appearing one cold morning with 2 coffees and no good explanation except, bought an extra. Hannah brought updates from the investigation and pretended it was only paperwork. Rebecca mailed Nate a copy of the old team photograph. On the back she had written, "Live the part they did not get." Nate placed it in a drawer at first. Later, he took it out and set it on the shelf above the stove. Atlas noticed, of course. He noticed everything. That night, when Nate woke from the old dream, The dream did not end with the same crushing certainty. Atlas came to him, placed his head on Nate's knee, and Nate whispered, "Maybe it wasn't all mine." The words shook when they came out. But they came out. Spring reached Red Ash Valley slowly, melting snow from the bridge first, then the ditches, then the shaded places beneath the pines. The old wooden bridge, where Atlas had found Eli, was repaired by volunteers from town. Maddox with a hammer he used badly, Hannah carrying boards, Claire handing out coffee, Eli painting one rail blue, because Graham had loved blue, and Nate working longer than anyone while pretending it was just a job. The rebuilt bridge was not beautiful in a polished way. It was sturdy, honest, good enough to carry weight. On the morning the center officially reopened, Nate and Atlas walked there before the small crowd arrived. Nate still wore his green digital camouflage uniform, properly fitted, boots clean, face composed. Atlas walked beside him in the tan tactical vest, alert and steady, but there was something easier in the rhythm between them now. On the far side of the bridge, Eli played with Scout near the fence. Claire helped the old Malinois take slow steps in a support harness. The old dog was still weak, but alive, each step a quiet argument against erasure. Pike stood near the gate speaking with Rebecca, both of them looking at the dogs with the sober respect of people learning that truth sometimes came on four legs. Halfway across the bridge, Atlas stopped. Nate stopped with him. For a heartbeat, the old fear returned. Nate looked toward the trees, the road, the shadows beneath the bridge. But Atlas was not warning. His ears were relaxed, his gaze forward. He turned his head and looked up at Nate, dark, amber eyes steady as morning. Nate understood then. The dog was not asking him to search. He was asking him to continue. Nate placed his hand on Atlas's head, feeling the warmth beneath the fur, the life that had refused to let him disappear into his own silence. "All right," he said softly. Together, they crossed the bridge. Behind them was the place where a boy had nearly frozen and a secret had first surfaced. Ahead of them was a center being rebuilt, dogs being renamed truthfully, people learning how to stand inside imperfect justice, and a soldier who no longer had to carry every ghost alone. Some truths are buried in files, contracts, and fear. Some are hidden inside scars, but loyalty has a way of finding what lies cannot hold forever. And sometimes God does not send a miracle with thunder. Sometimes he sends a dog who will not leave the bridge until the broken are found. Sometimes God does not send a miracle with thunder, bright lights, or a voice from the sky. Sometimes he sends a loyal dog who refuses to walk away. Sometimes he sends a frightened child with the truth hidden in a sketchbook. Sometimes he sends one broken man back across the same bridge where his healing was meant to begin. Nate thought he had survived only to carry guilt. But through Atlas, through Eli, and through the truth that finally came into the light, he learned that God can use even the deepest wounds to guide someone else home. In our everyday lives, we may not always understand why certain people, animals, or moments cross our path. But sometimes the quietest signs are the ones heaven uses to lead us toward justice, forgiveness, and a second chance. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who believes in loyalty, courage, and the kind of love that never gives up. Comment where you are watching from, and tell us which moment moved you the most. Subscribe to Navy SEAL and K9 Stories for more emotional stories about faith, sacrifice, healing, and the unbreakable bond between soldiers and their dogs. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide every loyal heart watching this story today.